Afrinia,
Afrinia,
my country, my home. Afrinia,
Afrinia,
my country, my home. Facing the future as people, the pride of our fathers who fought for this land. From the forests to the mountains, through the plains to the sea, Afrinia's progress makes Africa free. Afrinia,
Afrinia,
my country, my home. Afrinia,
Afrinia,
my country, my home.
Afrinia is a very small country located on the Gulf of Tropicalia. It is bordered on the east by the Democratic Republic of Rebello and on the west by the Kingdom of Naloland. In the north, there is a country called Floxania with very deep roots and relationships with the Flock people who live in the north of Afrinia. There is also a small group that live close to the capital, Palmero, which itself is located on the Gulf of Tropicalia. This is very important information because the mere location of the country and its neighbors in many ways affect the politics, the economics, and the social structure of Afrinia. So I thought it was important that you get a chance to visualize where this country is located, as it may look familiar to some of you who have lived and worked in Africa. Afrinia has four major groups. The Rebellos and the Nolosa are the two largest groups, each constituting about 40% of the population. The difference is that one group, cotton subsistence farmers, the Nolosa, have a high unemployment rate and a high migration rate. On the other hand, the Rebello are small-scale traders and are very, very prosperous, and they live in the east of the country. You will note that the Flock are primarily indigenous people, and they live in the north, they live in the forests, and they're very poor. And then we have a small immigrant minority population called the Alats. They live in the southeast, in the urban areas around the capital city. They're involved in citrus farming, and they're very wealthy. It's very important, again, to note how these four groups interact with each other and the social structure of this country. We spent a lot of time in class over the past few weeks speaking about women, the role of women in development. And in Afrinia, women have equal political rights, they say. But all of the statistics tell us that they lack access to education and political power. They have very limited land ownership rights. And astonishingly, only 30% of the girls attend primary school. So despite all that we talk about women in this country, there's a problem. Afrinia also suffers from great poverty. Poverty is something that describes this country. Rural poor, primarily in subsistence agriculture, urban poor. The most intractable form of poverty is found among the Flock and the Nolosa people. Remember, the Nolosa are people who are cotton farmers, and the Flock are the people who live in the north and live in the forest. This social situation led to a war. And we've talked about conflict, what happens during conflict, what happens after conflict. So here's a country that had a 10-year civil war. The way that the country tried to solve this problem is by putting together a constitution that essentially tried to balance the power between the various groups. At the end of the war, it was agreed that the president must always be a rebel, and he or she would serve a term of 8 years. There would be proportional representation of all groups and all regions in the parliament, but the prime minister must always be a Noloso. So the two largest groups in the country, the two largest ethnic groups, one will be the president, one will have the prime minister elected by the parliament. The minister of finance must be an Allot, must come from the Allot group, and the chief justice of the country must be a Flock. That compromise, that political compromise, that political deal is also in many ways reflected in the nature of the economy of this country. I said earlier it was a very poor country. Here's a bit of information about the national economy. $400 per capita. We've been using $2.50 a day. $2 a day would constitute abject poverty. And a GDP the size of 16 billion, $400 per capita. That means that large numbers of the population are below the poverty line. The growth rate has only been 2.5% over 7 years. Stagnation, not a lot of growth. The local currency is called the Koro, and the rate as of today is $1 is equal to 20 Koros. The annual rate of inflation is 7%, or just below 7%. But what is really striking is that the external debt is 394% of GDP. Those of you who have been following developments in Europe recognize that that level of debt is not sustainable, and the government of Afrinia has had to undertake a reform program. Now, if you're not specializing in economics, if you're not focusing on economics, some of this may be a little bit boring, but it's very interesting to note that the country of Afrinia has successfully negotiated with the World Bank something called the HIPIC debt relief. This is a debt relief program for the highly indebted poor countries. And there's a group of countries that have been categorized as HIPIC countries, and they've been able to negotiate debt relief or debt forgiveness from the World Bank and the other multilateral agencies. The government has also prepared something called a PRSP, a Poverty Reduction Strategy paper. Now we only call it the PRS, but it's a Poverty Reduction Strategy. And this is the government telling the world, if you forgive our debt, here's what we will do with the money that we would have otherwise used to pay and service our debt. This is what we will do with it. For Afrinia, the PRSP says they will do a couple of things. They will consolidate gains from macro stabilization and increase domestic revenue mobilization. That is, they will make a very serious attempt to get people to pay their taxes, to get corporations to pay their dues, domestic revenue mobilization. They will seek and find ways of paying their way. They will strengthen budget management and expenditure tracking. No longer can government spend money willy-nilly. The fact that you have to track expenditure means that they're beginning to put in place some policies and programs to cut back on the rampant corruption and malfeasance that takes place within government and with government revenues. They will reform the public sector. We talked about teachers that don't show up, ghost teachers. We talk about public servants that do not report to work, medical officers that are not there. The entire public sector, how they work, how they're staffed. There's going to be a movement to cut back on those things, to reform how government works, particularly the public sector. And finally, with whatever monies they save through debt relief, they plan to improve the delivery of services in key social sectors such as health, education, and social protection. Now, this reform program is not unlike what we're hearing even in the United States. Certainly, we hear about this in Europe. Now, one of the things that a country is always asked to do by the World Bank and the IMF when they're going through this restructuring process, when they're undertaking a reform program, is to undertake a certain amount of analytic work. Now, we've discussed in class many times that there are many what I call urban myths. They're things that we believe but are not evidence-based. What we try to do, and what Afrinia is trying to do, is to say, judge us on our performance, let us know exactly where it is that we need to make the changes, and we will do that first and foremost by doing some analytical work. We want to know through household surveys who are the people that are suffering and who receive the resources. We will undertake a poverty and social impact assessment. This is a core diagnostic so that if you're targeting poverty, you know exactly where poverty exists locally and regionally. Public expenditure review. How is the government spending its money? Where is the money going? A financial accountability assessment. This is an assessment also that begins to get into governance, procurement. Is the competition fair and open? Is everybody getting an equal access to bid on these contracts? And of course, the country economic memorandum, which looks at all of the key indicators and developments that are going on. But there is one thing that this very poor country suffers. We call it the corruption factor. And the government has decided that it wants to look at the corruption factor very closely. Discretionary application of taxes and customs regulations. This is particularly true for imports and exports. And poor countries have to depend on lots of imports. Illegal logging, a great asset of the country of Afrinia. Lots of it is illegally logged and shipped overseas for large amounts of money that never get into the public coffers. Unofficial sales of public services. Who owns the land? Who gets the titles, property rights? Ad hoc additional service fees demanded by low-pay education and health workers. You've heard the stories, you've seen the videos, you've read the papers. Do I pay the headmaster a bribe so that my child can get into school? When I show up at the hospital and I want to get medicine, do I have to pay somebody? These are petty, small forms of corruption, but it erodes the system. And finally, you have the local judiciary, which has undermined business confidence because the rule of law does not prevail, and you have local officials who are in the pockets of some of the illegal business people. So the corruption factor is big in Afrinia, and they try to do something about it. When we talked about monoculture, monocropping, use of pesticides and all of that during the class, The agriculture sector is very, very big in Afrinia. 78% of the population is engaged in formal and informal farming, and 21% of GDP comes from this. It means simply that agriculture is not as efficient as it should be. 90% of sector growth is barely above the population rate of 3%. So we need to work on and to think about what is happening in agriculture that needs work. The government has a monopoly almost in agriculture, particularly in the cotton sector. And you read more and hear more about cotton house as you get into your exercise. So rather than spending a lot of time on it, I just want to focus on a couple of points. Cotton House, it's a government-owned entity. It distributes seeds, fertilizer, pesticides to farmers at the start of every growing season. And all of the crop of the farmers has to be sold to Cotton House. That will tell you a little bit about the role of Cotton House in Afrinia. In the forestry sector, it's only about 7%. But Afrinia has a high-value form of commercial timber. It's actually called the tahogany. It also is very much a part of ecotourism, and it helps with the production of wood products. But 50% deforestation over the last 10 years. And a lot of that comes from illegal logging and stuff that is sold at auction in Floxania. So in the north, that's where the forests are. You have this high-priced timber, but a lot of it is illegal. And you have the poorest people, the poorest 15% of the people live in that part of the country. Health. We did a lot of discussion about health promotion. We understood the difference between morbidity and mortality. We talked about a range of these diseases. When Allison came to class, she talked about these things. Two things to note. High incidence of HIV/AIDS. 14% of the adults aged between 15 to 49 are infected. And life expectancy has actually dropped in Afrinia to 49 years. But this does not stop a population growth at about 2.5%. Only less than 40% of married couples use contraceptives. So, high infection rate, lots of morbidity and mortality from malaria, tuberculosis, diarrheal diseases, dengue, and a population growth of 2.5%, which is not sustainable. The education sector is also an area where we have to stop and take a deep breath. Only 1% of GDP is spent on education. We know that the school curriculum is outdated. Class sizes are large. In the film that you saw about the young students in many countries of the world, I think in Kenya it was that we saw the size of the classes in that ghetto in Nairobi. Shortages of basic teaching materials, and even if a teacher is very, very creative, as we see in the film, it really leads to poor quality education. In many cases, the teachers are unmotivated. They have to work 2 jobs because they are living below subsistence. The wages are below subsistence. Schools lack water and latrines. 50% of the schools are incomplete. And access is constrained by the lack of rural roads. So the education sector also reflects the poverty in the country. lots of challenges. Schools are inadequate, teachers are inadequately trained, curriculum is weak, and of course the country does not spend any money on that. Now, one could keep piling on about how bad things are, but this is part of the nature of development, and it's also nature of what kind of educational system, how do you build an educational system in situations such as we see in Afrinia. A lot of bits of information. Transport. 1 mile is paid for every 10 miles. Difficult access. Energy. Less than 8% have access to electricity. Water supply. Only 20% have access to treated piped water, and less than 5% in rural areas. Telecommunications. Less than 15% of urban households have telephones. Okay. Let me close here by saying the International Development Association, or IDA, which is one of the 5 members of the World Bank Group. Remember, IDA actually only lends to the poorest of the poor countries. And when we say lend, we actually make something called credits or grants. What has been the IDA experience in Afrinia? To date, 9 projects, $500 million, and they have been concentrated in roads, forestry, primary education, health, and technical assistance to support actually the reform program. This, in a nutshell, is Afrinia. Our experience, the World Bank's experience in Afrinia, in terms of the portfolio and how well it's working or not working, there have been some challenges. And this is just to give a little bit of a background as you prepare for your assignment. Projects take longer than we expected, and so we have to extend closing dates. Even when you make money available, sometimes it's difficult to disburse that money or to spend that money. We have an index, the World Bank has an index, and we talk about proactivity. No need to discuss it, except to say that proactivity should be at 100%. In the case of Afrinia, it's only 73%. Counterpart funding remains a problem, and that has to do with how development financing takes place. I can lend you dollars, but you, the country, have to come up with some of your own local currency because some of the goods and the services will be paid for in your currency. The World Bank doesn't have corals. The government of Afrinia has corals. So if it doesn't have what we call counterpart funding, then it gets to get difficult doing a development project. But that's all I think we need to say about Afrinia at this stage. Darren will come back to you with the exercise and how you work in teams to solve a problem on a national scale in a very poor country. Thank you.